Like lots of bad shit happens and everyone hates it. And it's like, man, that sucks. That's the new objective and unchangeable reality we have to reckon with, I guess.
Yeah.
Hello, this is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Owen, and here with me today is Gil.
Hello.
Lillian.
Hi.
And Will.
What's up?
So in today's episode, we're discussing Machiavelli, specifically The Prince and some passages from the Discourses. In many ways, Machiavelli is one of those thinkers who needs no introduction. His notoriety, even infamy, are inscribed in the English language. Machiavellian means cunning, scheming, and unscrupulous. But this very apparent familiarity betrays the complexity both of his thought and its reception. Perhaps no other thinker has been claimed by such diverse political and theoretical movements. His work has been an inspiration to conservatives, to Marxists, and to communists, to classical and contemporary republicanism, and to many others. Given the nature of our podcast, it should come as no surprise that Machiavelli's recruitment to the side of historical materialist philosophy and the politics of the left is particularly significant. But his potential contributions to the Republican notion of freedom as non-domination is something I also hope to explore. So in our discussion today, there are a few concepts and problems that have been especially significant for these traditions that I want to focus on. Firstly, his notion of virtù, or political virtue. So despite his reputation for endorsing pure ruthlessness, this is how he's usually known, virtue is arguably the most important concept in his entire corpus. Of course, his notion of virtue is rigorously distinguished from our usual understanding of moral virtue and has to do with the ability to mold the course of events, to meet the forces of fortuna with strategic cunning. But contrary to his popular caricature, Machiavelli does not dismiss the moral virtues entirely and has harsh words for figures like Agathocles the Sicilian, who knows only cruelty and violence. Likewise, his admiration for the Roman Republic in the Discourses is due to his contention that at no other time in history has so much virtue flourished in one place. So I want to focus on that concept of virtue, firstly. And then secondly, I want to talk a little bit about the peculiar place he occupies in philosophy. Not only as a matter of personal biography, since he was politically active, but as Gramsci and Althusser have emphasized, Machiavelli was a fierce partisan, and he wrote and thought from a position of partisanship. The Prince is a manifesto for the liberation of Italy from foreign control, and as such, I see it as an early participant in the rich tradition of partisan philosophical works, such as those written by Marx and Engels, Frantz Fanon, and others. Philosophy, in his hands, does not seek to resolve philosophical problems. It doesn't even address them. Rather, Machiavelli's partisan philosophical practice addresses itself to problems in the world, a world in which it aspires to become a force. And so those are the two things I'd like to start our discussion with, that concept of virtue, and then the weird status, I guess, that Machiavelli has as a philosopher who doesn't care about philosophy. A philosopher who cares about the world and cares about practice and addresses himself exclusively to that.
What do you all think are some of the dominant interpretations of that concept of virtue or political virtue? I feel like there's a lot of different actors that use this. What is it supposed to be? Is it a classical notion of virtue, or is it something else? When we think about an ancient idea of virtue of right-mindedness and moderation and so on. I feel like he means something different, in a specifically political kind of virtue, and this is why people sort of run with Machiavelli, but I think there's some different ways of using it that I'm curious to know what your impressions of it are.
Yeah, I think it has a number of, has diverse sources. I mean, one of them I think is a kind of Aristotelian notion of phronesis, or practical wisdom or practical reason. But unlike Kant, a practical reason that's actually practical. But yeah, I mean, clearly he's trying to just both, take over a number of traditions and to distinguish himself from a number of understandings of virtue, right? So he rigorously distinguishes that concept of virtue from any Christian conception we might have of it relating to like piety or chastity or any of those pious or deeply moral notions of virtue. But it's also not just, I guess the problem is that it's different in the Prince than versus in the Discourses, right? And there are two different projects in a certain way, right? Virtue in the Prince has to do with like virtue of political practice specifically, right? It has to do with virtue as the capacity to acquire and to maintain power. Right, and then whereas elsewhere he'll speak in the Discourses, for example, of the virtues of the citizenry, who don't become basically lazy and useless because of too much access to resources or a kind of poor culture, which he says basically that that you have to have a populace that possesses a certain level of discipline. So like there's virtue at the level of the citizenry, then there's virtue at the level of the prince, and they seem to be distinct. And I think it's worth at least kind of marking that distinction.
Yeah. So it's really cool that we're doing this right after Spinoza, because I see them being so closely related and so on the same page in so many ways. And I think that, some people think of Spinoza as a virtue ethicist, and it's true, but like it's much more in this sort of Machiavellian way, where virtue does mean something, like at least in the Prince, right, as like power or like capacity, more than sort of any sense of like, I don't know, moral uprightness. I mean, so like, you brought up the instance of Agathocles, right? And this was like in the part of the Prince where he's talking about, I think it's the chapter on cruelty, right? Whether it's better to be feared or loved, if I'm not mistaken. But he brings up Agathocles, who he like captures his state. He becomes a prince just by doing the worst stuff ever, and he's extremely extra about it. He's like, yeah, he brought in all his friends and he killed him, and then a couple weeks later he killed all his friends again, and he's poisoning everybody and lying, and it's really bad.
He just kept at it.
He just couldn't stop killing.
Can't stop, won't stop.
He's like that. He says something interesting, which is that those people like that, might be able to seize power, but they'll never be able to get glory, which I think is interesting. And it's sort of also like, Hobbes says similar things too about how like there's this like power question and this glory question. They're not the same. But and as a matter of like realpolitik, he's just like, well, Agathocles fucked up. Like, turns out he went like, if you actually want to seize power, just doing it like that's not gonna like he's able to.
Yeah, but again, it's not a moral issue, right? Like,
it's not a moral issue.
Yeah,
exactly.
Like the problem with being that cruel is that you become hateful, right? He says it's important to have notoriety, but as soon as you become hateful, hate is now one of the forces in the field of force relations you have to contend with.
Right. Where he says like, if it's true that you can't both be feared and loved, rather be feared, but don't be hated, right? You can be feared without being hated, and he thinks that that's an important pragmatic.
Yeah, because he thinks that you have to do enough good things over time, but consistently, so that people stay grateful. So you can be feared, but people can be grateful. So he has this whole way of like rationing out the kind of, I guess, affects that the population is supposed to have under a virtuous republic, or in one case the prince, but also he talks about this in terms of the balance of powers in the republic at large. So there's a virtue management regime that I feel like Machiavelli is interested in.
Yeah, when I was reading Machiavelli, especially the part that you all are talking about now, it's about ratios, right? So he's saying like, it is better if you're building a new state to do all the violence at once. Do it quick, do it dirty, but then you have something stable and let the people know that this is something good. The worst thing you can do is you do that violence, but not all at once. You get to keep parceling it out day by day by day, and that's a recipe for rebellion and revolution. And so the way that I understood Machiavelli on virtue, and I also love this concept, is that it seems like the way it works is it's not necessarily Machiavelli has to be saying something like, there is no morality. But what he's saying is, in the field of forces that is politics, those virtues that you describe in the field of morality are not virtues in this field of forces. They don't have the capacity to do the things that you want to do, to mold events, etc. So what he's describing as virtue are the skills that are indexed to this contextual field that is politics. And that must mean that politics is, a specifically delimited space of activity community that's different than what you do between, your friends. In our, our little beginning bit, Owen made a joke about, I'm not sure it'd be great to be a Machiavellian in a romantic relationship. I imagine there are certain virtues of the prince that aren't great in romantic relationships. Maybe. I don't know. I'm probably a terrible partner. But yeah. And so virtue is about power relative to the sort of terms of order of the field that they're operating in. That's what I was starting to get from Machiavelli.
Right. I like that insistence on the specificity of politics. I think it's one of Machiavelli's great kind of contributions to the history of thought is to take politics as its own object, not understood in relation to theology, not subordinated to moral categories, but analyzed on its own terms. And so it's not, the point isn't to be immoral in that sense, right? The point is to ask a different set of questions and to find a different set of imperatives that are proper to a particular domain. Right?
So that you can all stop faking each other out that these papal states are in line with the city of God.
Yeah, exactly.
So that you can have a moment of real talk in the
nobody knows force and fraud more than the Pope.
True. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the text of political philosophy at this time, until Machiavelli comes around, is the Summa Theologica, right? Yeah. Where we're talking about Civitas Dei. That's very different. Mm-hmm. And there we have that is governed by the sort of old Aristotelian concept of virtue, where there's this hierarchy of different modes of relating to one another, and the virtue then of the ruler is the same as the virtue of everybody else. And Machiavelli's no, this stuff is actually the way that you were putting it, Will. I like it a lot. It's very context specific, right? In each case, the question is going to be what does it look like to be virtuous here and now, given this existing organization of force relations. And this is why he's all of his examples are always so rich, because he's well, yeah, I know it sounded like I was saying that this or that characteristic is always good, but didn't work here, did it? Because the situation was different. It's conjunctural.
Totally.
Right?
That's why I think the question of even Lily, in your original question, is a good one. Just what is virtue and where is he getting this concept from? Because his way of proceeding, his method, is not very philosophical in a certain sense. He doesn't offer a definition of virtue anywhere, right? He doesn't offer definitions. I don't think he very rarely. Let's put it this way. I don't want to go all in.
We have definitions of principality.
Yeah, exactly. But he very rarely gives you definitions, right? What he tries to do is from a combination of historical examples and contemporary experience, right, to draw out the meaning of a concept through an analysis of its place or its its specificity to a specific situation. Okay, specificity to a specific. Its specificity to a situation.
I'm going to leave that in.
Absolutely. Specificity to a specific? Damn, that's real specific.
That is extraordinarily specific. That's right. But I was thinking of the example of, for instance, and there's a part of his analysis here that I actually wanted to talk about. But he's talking about Hannibal at some point, the military leader. And he's when you're the ruler of a principality, you don't want to be cruel, right? Cruelty is going to, again, engender this hatred that people are going to, hold it against you and so on. He's but it's different when you're running an army. Sometimes then cruelty is actually the way to go. And so Hannibal was able to, achieve all of this great military success, in part in and through of his excessive cruelty. And the thing that's interesting about one of the things that he says there is historians condemn Hannibal for his cruelty while praising his successes, not understanding that there's a causal relationship here. And this happens a bunch in his reading of these historical cases. He's people are constantly condemning the causes of the effects that they've created.
This is exactly what Kant does with the French Revolution, right? Where he says that, basically the actors of the French Revolution were deeply immoral and they should have never done any of the stuff that they did. But we have to
great
praise
stuff came from it, though.
We have to praise the moral significance of, and we basically have to see as morally praiseworthy the effects of the revolution.
It's kind of your friend brings you a big screen TV and you love it. And I stole it off the back of a truck. You know what? Hey, but I love this TV though.
But I am going to keep the television.
I am absolutely going to keep the television.
I'm definitely not returning it.
First of all, any friend that responds in that way ain't a real friend.
Yeah. Take that TV. They're not a real friend. Yeah. as you all were talking, I'm wondering if what I find fascinating with Machiavelli is he's actually even assuming that you can do a science of politics, but obviously it's not a science that takes place in a lab. He thinks the real world is where we do our experimentations. So I was caught by, it's weird reading Machiavelli. It's just so many historical examples, and you might start to think, how is this philosophy? But he's thinking a philosophy that really stands the test of being a force in the world has to actually look at the evidence. And so the type of science he's doing is that if politics is a field of forces, at some points you can almost feel him saying, we can start to map this out and quantify it. And that's how we can start to understand, what virtues in specific conjunctures are going to win out. To assume that there is a type of rationality to the field of politics that, he's writing a Prince for, other leaders, that with this knowledge, they can now know how it is to rule.
Right. I feel like I was going to say something similar. There's this conversation about Machiavelli where I feel like we have to think about different interpretations of him. So there's a mainstream interpretation of Machiavelli of like realpolitik, like there's just, it's sort of, everything is sort of like a random contest of power and affects. And this exists on the right, and then it also exists on the left, oddly enough, like a kind of left populism. How to navigate the political sphere by just making various contestations discursively or in movements, like bodies banging against each other and so on. And then, unsurprisingly, I wonder about the materialist interpretation, which I feel like when I read Machiavelli, it opens up to me so immediately because he talks about there's these effects that happen and there's a rationality to them. We can start to piece together this way of thinking about political development and the evolution of certain effects, and we can do that by looking at their causes. And specifically, when we want to understand why some regimes have more virtue than others, it's because of the way that they're organized. So why is the Roman Republic better? Why is it so close to perfection and more virtuous than any other republic? Well, there was these plebeians, the plebs, and they had these tribunes, and they were able to be intermediary between the assembly,
the Senate,
and the Senate and the nobility
and the consulate.
But this is ambiguous because the reason this can still be a sort of idealist Machiavelli is that even though he's talking about causes, he is just talking about political institutions. And so you can isolate this realm of the political and have this kind of institutional Machiavelli. But it is just one small step to ask, okay, but are those the only causes? Are those the deep causes? And then you're into more materialist territory. Not that the institutions don't matter, they do, but why did they take on those forms? Why were the people in a position to be in those tribunes and so on? So there's just these different versions of it. There's the institutionalist, there's the kind of more right-wing realpolitik version, there's the left-wing populist version. And I don't think that Machiavelli was like a historical materialist, but there's this opening for it. And I don't know, just wanted to throw those options out there.
I like that a lot. I mean, we get into a similar problem maybe that Gill identifies with the reception of Spinoza as a kind of materialist. And because I think there's so much in Machiavelli, like in Spinoza, that lends itself to a historical materialist philosophy. But there's also a lot that I think resists being appropriated in that way. But I think specifically with the question of politics and these institutions in the states, like one of the things I think has appealed to Marxists and historical materialists about Machiavelli is that there's a thinking of the state in its specificity, not just as a kind of pale reflection of material conditions, right? And so one of the things I think that drew Gramsci and then the later Althusser also to Machiavelli was basically Machiavelli functioned as a kind of resource for pushing beyond what they felt was a tired and monocausal view of the state as just an epiphenomenal outcome of economic processes, right? So you don't have to hypostatize the state and like isolate it and fetishize it as a result of that. But I do think that Machiavelli is very helpful if you're trying to not entirely collapse politics into the economic. Machiavelli is one place to go to figure out, well, what is specific to politics then? Like, what are we doing when we do politics that isn't the same thing as raw class struggle?
Right. Okay. So I just want to add one more thing about this, that like, I get that, and I'm friendly to that, because I feel like if you are a political agent in a modern state, or you want to kind of understand what is going on in the processes they're in, then there is something really useful here. I feel like the problem with relying on the distinctiveness of the political and having Machiavelli try to solve that problem for you is that the distinction between politics and economics is, for the first time under capitalism, a problem in itself. So you want to get at the specificity of the political, but this can always reify the distinction between the economic and the political, which is, interestingly, in his time, not true. So he sees it as primarily political, and he occasionally references other causes. I don't think he has a monocausal idea, but he's dealing with politically constituted economic power in a way that we're not dealing with now. So when modern theorists appropriate Machiavelli, I guess I'm only flagging this tendency to reify the political as special is because I feel in a lot of left populist writing, they have in pushing back against economic reductionism, I think it seems undeniable to me that there has been a re-fetishizing of the state. So there's this way in which that dynamic can reproduce itself based on the conditions that we're currently in. And I think that's kind of a problem in just making Machiavelli your ally for politics specifically.
Well, also, I just want to quickly, jump off of that, because I have this question with Machiavelli, especially I'm sticking with the Prince here. So it's not only that he's talking with the specificity of the political or politics, but, this is also written towards a specific notion of how power is constituted. And by that, I mean, it's the question of leadership. This is not a how-to manual for, the unwashed masses. This is not a how-to manual for what does it mean to build power from the ground up. Many of his historical examples deal with, because these historical figures clearly have made themselves available to history by virtue of the fact that they had either grand successes or, as often, grand failures. That, this is also a vision of politics that really focuses on what does the leader do? Can the leader accomplish? So, I can say a little bit why I might think that might be a limitation, but let me stick with the positive. The positive of this seems to be, I think many people do think of politics in terms of great leaders, for better and for worse. And what this is opening the question is, so what does it mean to lead? What are the capacities you ought to have in order to accomplish your goals? And so even, taking on, sort of what Lillian is saying, I think we can, push it and say, well, what Machiavelli is asking is, if you really want to be pragmatic in the field of politics, and by that you seem to take yourself to be a leader, I'm talking to some hypothetical person. So what are the virtues you would need to develop, and what are the analyses that you need to develop in order to know what virtues you require in order to develop any sort of orderly force?
Yeah, and how do you analyze the conjuncture? No, I like that.
Yeah.
Because, how do you understand those virtues, but also how do you analyze the conjuncture? Because understanding society is obviously something very different than trying to change it, right? And so when you have a partisan political project, the knowledge you have to mobilize is very different than the knowledge that, it's not unrelated, right? But I would presume that it's quite different than if you're just trying to understand how Rome was composed the way it was. For example, at that time, what economic forces made it were responsible for generating its particular political form, which I think a good historical explanation does. But if you are engaged in a revolutionary project, and you have a kind of partisan ambition to alter the social field in an important way, then your kind of knowledge, or at least this is what I kind of gather from Machiavelli, is that your knowledge of society as a field of forces, of course, includes economic forces, but for him it includes a whole bunch of other forces as well, right? He even includes the humors of the people that you're dealing with. You have to take that into account. What is the kind of particular culture that you're operating with? What is, he includes factors to do with, geography and all of these different elements, right? The field of force relations is complex, and I think that it's totally viable to go a Marxist route and to say that, well, what's determinative? The determinative force in that field of force relations is economic forces. But you still have, from the vantage point of a political project, to deal with a whole diverse set of forces that go beyond just economics. Does that kind of respond to what to what you were saying, Lillian?
Not really, because
Okay.
I feel like the field of forces, what I'm saying is that so I agree with what you're saying about the leadership and the skills you need. Like, I do think Machiavelli is useful in all of those ways and understanding the myriad forces. I think I was jumping ahead a little bit from where we were in the conversation to like how Machiavelli is configured today as either distinctively, the person who thinks about the political and not just the economic. And I think that on the left is a problem because it can end up like what you're saying, like, of course, it's not about the ultimate causes. It's about whether or not you understand that problem is in itself part of our distinct conjuncture and the complexity of forces. So like he is looking at a complex field and he is dealing with politically constituted power. When he talks about politics and economics, he doesn't need to specify them. They're not different. We live in a modern state and a modern economy in which they are different. So when we analyze our conjuncture, we have to take the separation of the economic and the political, at least institutionally, as a part of our field of forces. So it's not just about what's like the ultimate cause. And I feel like what I've seen in theorists who want to talk about the political as something distinctive is that in saying, it's not just the economic, it's also the political. Like what we end up doing is then focusing on the political as opposed to an integrated analysis of what is actually complex and distinct about this particular set of institutional problems that we have. And then the other part, so that's like on the left, the kind of re-fetishizing of the political is what I'm worried about. Then in terrain that isn't necessarily of the left, like the kind of Republican appropriations of Machiavelli, there's undeniably just a reinscription of like what we're talking about are just political institutions, like civic virtues, constitutionalism, and so on. So I feel like that is kind of the dominant weight that Machiavelli carries. And I think it's very valuable, but I also think like there is something that I get wary about, not because I don't think it's valuable, but because I feel like that separation gets not integrated in the analysis as a part of the problem. It ends up being like, well, we can't want to add in the political, it's not, economics aren't the only causes, like fine. But it's actually the two of them and how they appear distinct institutionally and are not. So yeah, maybe that was jumping ahead a little bit to like the interpretations from where we were at, but.
Well, okay, so shifting focus slightly, like one of the things, so I was thinking about this line by Althusser in one of his Machiavelli pieces, because it is the case that Machiavelli is trying to think about, politics, and for all of the reasons that you're saying, Lillian, and I think you're totally right. Like the sort of apparent separation of the political and the economic is a feature of our reality that was not present in the 1500s. But Althusser says that Machiavelli is like bearing witness to and is theorizing a process of what he calls primitive political accumulation, which I think is really fascinating. And so like he is dealing with a certain configuration of politics and economics and how they're articulated in a way that's distinct and different from what we have today. But he's also seeing something like the birth of the modern nation state, and trying to figure out how to position himself within that historical trajectory and to, influence and determine it. Like, the Prince ends with this like call for the formation of an Italian state, a process that he saw being, if it had ever really started, certainly unfinished and like, continually failed. And so I wanted to just like kind of throw up this question of like how we read Machiavelli as someone who's trying to think about the processes by which political forces are constituted and political structures are constituted, and like the sort of birth of the nation state, modern nation state, as like a kind of specific moment of that, and maybe wonder what that reading might be helpful for us
I like that.
Today on the left in light of the distinctions that you're making.
That's actually really helpful because there's something else that I wanted to bring up why I was also really excited about reading Machiavelli. So in this collected volume called African American Political Thought, Melvin Rogers and I believe Jack Turner are the editors. Michael Dawson, a political scientist at University of Chicago, has this amazing essay called Marcus Garvey, The Black Prince, and his main argument in this article is that Garvey actually read Machiavelli and took them very seriously. And it molded his political vision of what does it mean to create a black nation state. And Dawson's argument is that what Garvey took from Machiavelli is that it's not just, this notion of virtues of the leader, but one of the virtues that he takes Machiavelli to say the leader needs to have is an eye for fortune. So we've talked a lot about virtue, but not enough, I think, about fortuna. And what Garvey saw and what he thought he saw in Machiavelli is this notion that what makes also the leader able to steer political events is they can see the opening. So that's not completely up to them, but being able to see when the balance of forces and powers creates an opening, that's up to fortune. And that you need to sort of craft that sensibility. And so what he's getting from this is that he's arguing that Garvey sees that in order to create a nation state, we need a leader who can see the openings for the creation of a new politics. And so what we're getting in Machiavelli is not just you need to have these virtues. You need to be able to see the conditions and seize the moment. And I am, at least the way that I'm reading Machiavelli, that really is invested in this person of the leader. It is not movements that seize the moment. It is leaders who can grasp the opening of fortune or fortuna, and that is what allows for the creation of something like a nation state. And so you have people who have the correct virtues, but if fortune is not on their side, well, what can you do? There's only so much one can do. And so I wanted to zero in on this specific political capacity of being open to fortune and seeing when you need to make the move towards whatever your goal is.
Yeah, this is part of why Machiavelli's obsessed with the case of Cesare Borgia, right? Who is this dude, if I'm not mixing them up, I think it's Cesare Borgia, who's who does everything right, has what I would have identified as all of the correct virtuous capacities, right? Is strategic and cunning and putting on the right face, and fortune just crushed him, right? He wasn't able, the conjuncture wasn't favorable. It doesn't matter to a certain extent. You're not going to be able to force these kinds of developments in the absence of what you called, Will, the opening, right? And so figuring out how to identify it is a really interesting sort of strategic and political question as well.
Yeah, this is why he doesn't offer kind of universal and timeless accounts of the virtues, right? He says that the situation is changeable, and so our relationship to it also has to be changeable. And he always points to these people that get stuck inside of a certain set of precepts that they want to govern by. And then
old people, he says. Only
yeah,
the
old
youth.
people, yeah, exactly.
Too, yeah.
And it works for a bit, until it doesn't, and they can't adapt and alter those precepts. I think we call that flip-flopping or being inconsistent. But for him, that's the peak of virtue, right? The ability to actually adapt to conjunctural changes, to adapt strategically to conjunctural changes. But I want to just say something else about this, the idea of primitive political accumulation that you pointed to, Gil, that's Althusser's expression, and showing that, the state does not, the origin of the state does not lie in all the kind of nice stories that we get with social contract thinkers, right? And so if you think Hobbes, for example, right, Hobbes says, he has this line in Leviathan where he says that in the state of nature, right, the two cardinal virtues are force and fraud. Right. Well, for Machiavelli, force and fraud are just straight up the virtues of politics. Right. It's not like in the state of nature that once you get into civil society or once you get into the state, now there's a different set of virtues. That's crazy. Look around look around anywhere right now. I mean, you really don't think that we're governed through force and fraud? Right. So give me a break. But I think.
Wait a minute.
What?
I'm going to take my votes back.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, where I saw you going is also what you get with Machiavelli is, so what are we doing when we're trying to understand politics? So, I think about this current moment in the United States of trying to paint this rosy picture of how the United States came to be, rather than talking about all that messy stuff at the beginning. And so with Machiavelli, he would say, if you want to forget that, you're going to actually miss, what politics consists of. That you're going to, this is the way that I think about it. Contracts are nice, But I think Machiavelli would say contract can never truly mitigate the forces of fortune, changing and shifting conditions. And so if you think politics is a sphere where we can, the aim is to finally stabilize everything, freeze it in place, and then we can just run on habits, well, he's going to, it seems as if he's saying something like, you can't fall asleep at the wheel. You have to remember that this needs constant recalibration. And that's not an authorization of like unbridled force and violence, which I think that's how some people read Machiavelli. They read realpolitik as unmitigated ruthlessness. I don't think that that's where he's going. He's simply trying to say that this is how politics emerges. This is how it continues to rearticulate itself. And if you want to turn a blind eye to that, don't be surprised when you find a knife in your back. Don't be surprised when things unravel for you.
Yeah, he says very specifically that there are two kinds of political combat, right? He says there's two ways of contending in politics, by laws or by force. And I think that one of the popular ways of seeing, he says armed force, right? But I think one of the popular ways of seeing Machiavelli, like you're saying, Will, is that it's all about force. It's all about the element of ruthlessness. It's all about, the willingness to use violence. But he's very key that he says, politics requires both natures. And part of what virtue is being able to distinguish when we're supposed to be man and when we're supposed to be a beast, right? It isn't about always being a beast. It's not about just the unbridled attempt to seize power or to maintain power, but it's about being able to distinguish at what moments principles are important. And, the attempts to move through institutional or legal channels, if you want to give it a more contemporary ring. And then what other times it's moving through institutional and legal channels is literally insane. It has no prospect of actually bearing any fruit.
I was going to say, reading Machiavelli, it makes me think about so many of the times when there are sort of left political movements and the virtue is there, but they completely misread what the conditions were. They completely, one could use the example, say, of something like, Black Lives Matter. And, adopting this idea, at least a formal organization that, a nonprofit way of trying to bring pressure on the government is the way to go. And completely sort of misunderstanding that is exactly the way you can get captured in this field of politics. And it strikes me that it's not easy identifying what the openings are and what the virtues are required for those openings, but at least what we can draw from Machiavelli is that type of cultivation of sensibility is necessary if you're going to navigate contemporary politics.
Yeah, I was thinking about this similarly in terms of what I've increasingly started to just call the crisis of civil society. So you all know that I've been pondering the problem of nonprofits for a long time, and I think happily there seems to be a left-wing ecosystem that's kind of getting hip to taking this seriously as a structural issue. But there's a way in which, for what I've noticed in political theory, at least since the early 2000s, there was this turn in critical theory, political theory, just kind of like the liberal left of the theory world, let's put it that way, that just thought civil society was the dopest. It was the way to combat the bureaucracy of the state, a more active civil society. And this discourse has just gone on and on and on. And in the meantime, civil society was changing. First of all, it was being dismantled in many of when we think, where do people go? What are civil society organizations today? We don't even fucking know. They're NGOs. They're nonprofits. I mean, your bowling league is gone. Your church is imploding, except for, I think, in minority communities. Your trade union is eroded. You don't go to your library for your reading groups. There's what civil society? And then
the homeowners association. That's all that's left.
Right. Yeah. And then
still going strong if you already have a home.
This nonprofit, you have this nonprofit industrial complex, or the social justice industry, whatever you want to call it. And people just seem to look at this all very uncritically. And I'm not trying to slam anybody, because I think it takes a while, it takes some experience in movements to get frustrated with the roadblocks that they put up to see And unfortunately, you have to work with them. I don't think there's like a clean break you can make from the nonprofit world at this point. But to see a problem there in the first place, and it just made me think about how the analysis of the conjuncture is lacking, like so strongly lacking in this way that is kind of like mind-bogglingly not there. And it's like without that, and that I do think is kind of the materialist like contribution, is like, what tools do you need to analyze the conjuncture? Because that's not just about the state, actually. That's a series of intermediary apparatuses,
power centers,
yeah. And you need to understand what they're doing. And if you don't have a social theory there to kind of like help you do that, then there's a way in which like whatever virtue you've got going on, it's going to be like kind of channeled down the wrong riverbank, like river. You know, it's going to be like kept corralled in the wrong place.
But I think Machiavellian virtue is about acquiring that sensitivity to power centers, right? Like extricating yourself from all of the moralisms. And, you know, we are witnessing in our contemporary moment, I think, an explosion of all manner of new moralisms.
Right.
And like Machiavelli's, I think what Machiavelli pushes us to do is to extricate ourselves from the moralisms, stop fighting on that moral terrain, and to identify in the field of force relations where the real genuine power centers are, the real points of leverage, right? And to exercise our power there, right? If the opportunity,
yeah, I think that's a better way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
No. I think cultivating the virtue is a part of like getting a grip on making the analysis is itself a part of exercising virtue.
Okay, so if we're thinking about like what does it look like to develop a good analysis of the conjuncture, there's like another part of all of these sorts of things that he says in all of these texts that I wanted to kind of draw our attention to and see what you think. So because he's got, I think, interestingly, like a weird kind of sensitivity to social antagonism already. This comes up in a couple of weird places, right? So like it happens in chapter 9, I think, of The Prince, where he says that the two different dispositions are found in every city. The people are everywhere anxious not to be dominated or oppressed by the nobles, and the nobles are out to dominate and oppress the people. And then similarly in the discourses too, he says this is in chapter 4 of book 1, in every republic there are two different tendencies, that of the people and that of the upper class, and that all of the laws that are passed in favor of liberty are born from the rift between the two. This is again where he's saying something like, people are condemning that there are these conflicts or disturbances between the people and the upper class in Rome, and he's like, well, out of that conflict comes all of the laws that engender the virtues and freedoms that make it a good historical example. But so I don't know. I was wondering what you all thought of it. It's because like there's a reading, again, there's so many different ways to read that. And some people read it as like a moment of like philosophical anthropology or political anthropology. They're like, people tend to just be one of these two things, or that these are inborn habits. Or if there's like, maybe a nascent sensitivity to like the kind of, emerging political or economic classes that it's happening around his time, or what to do with that. And I mean, it's what's interesting too is because he's, like we were saying before, kind of trying to do like a political science, like I think that his sympathies are pretty clearly on the side of the people, but he's also looking back and being like, well, actually, even right there, he's like, the question of like, whose hands do we want him? And he's like, well, if the question is longevity, historically the nobles have led longer polities, stuff like this. Like he's got this sort of commitment to empirical research, but also I think his politics are in fact on the side of the people. So there's like a lot there. I was just wondering what you all had to say about that.
That's actually an open question for me. I do sense that there's a tension between the Machiavelli of the Prince and the Machiavelli of the Discourses. At least the chapters in Machiavelli of the Prince, it's harder for me to make the argument that his sympathies are on the side of the people. At least the perspective he is taking is that who shapes history? Great leaders. And great leaders get an opportunity to do that. And so, looking between these two texts, the question I have for you is like, what is the philosophical role of historical examples that Machiavelli chooses for us. This is maybe this is a strange way to try to approach politics through, the way that I'm understanding Machiavelli, through a series of examples and trying to generate, more or less general inferences that we can draw from them. And so is it that Machiavelli is trying to say, here's a general anthropology of human beings, or is he saying, here is a particular constellation of these chosen examples, and from that we can, develop more general intuitions? So maybe this is a more question of methodology, of how do we use history to try to make our philosophical or political arguments of what we ought to do? Do the examples form the politics, or are the politics forming which examples that we're choosing? And so that's why it's hard for me to understand where Machiavelli's sympathies actually lie, because he's using so much of historical examples and trying to make a sort of collage and create some sort of coherent picture that it's unclear to me. Are these examples arbitrary? Are they because of other presuppositions he has that he's not being necessarily forthcoming with us on? It's unclear to me. Because I do think that there is a tendency of wanting to use history to inform our politics, and Machiavelli's doing something like that. But it's not that he wants us to repeat those histories, even though, that's why it seems different, the discourse, because it seems like the remote Roman Republic is pretty dope. But is he really counseling us to do that again? That seems completely different than the Machiavelli we have of the Prince.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is really enigmatic, because he has that line in the Discourses where he says that, I don't understand how people just read history as, to accumulate knowledge of facts. We should be looking at the deeds that were done and wondering how we can do, how they can inform our practice, basically, to paraphrase. I don't know about the question of the philosophical anthropology is interesting, but on that, I don't really know. I've struggled with how to, how to interpret that. But on the question of method, I do think that I buy Gramsci's insistence that there is a kind of methodological partisanship in Machiavelli. And that means that, the way he reads that is that there's a specific way of understanding this concept in Machiavelli of, my Italian is not really great, but verità effettuale della cosa, the effective truth of the case or something. It's apparently really hard to translate. But the way that Machiavelli sees the kind of relationship to the truth of the conjuncture is that it can only actually array itself in its objectivity from the vantage of a particular partisan project. And I think something similar applies to his view of history, right? That if you don't have a particular practical task in mind, then history just arrays itself as a kind of vast field of neutral facts, right? But the way that you bring history to life, just like in the way that you can get the best, and this is where it's interesting and I think really dialectical, the most objective understanding of the situation is to come at it in all of its chaotic variants with a principle of selection for what it is, a practically informed principle of selection for what it is that, that sticks out to you. What is it that is foregrounded and what falls into the kind of background? What appears as just noise and what appears as, a real kind of a real signal. And I know that's very, I'm abstracting a lot from the particularities of his cases, which you probably wouldn't love too much. But I do think that there is a larger kind of methodological partisanship that informs the way that he looks at both history and the way that he understands how virtue relates to historical conjunctures.
That really, brings to light for me, it's really fascinating that in our current moment, there is all these battles over history. And, whenever you try to tell one story, someone will say, aren't you leaving out this thing that happened or that thing that happened? What's so frustrating about the dialogue is, if we want to look at a Machiavellian standpoint, is it's the idea that there is some sort of neutral standpoint towards history that can make it come alive. But especially if you're talking about national politics and national political history, that is always going to be partisan history. That doesn't mean you just make things up. But, the fact that you cannot tell all of history without excerpting certain things, deselecting other things, that makes, again, the question of, well, what use are you trying to put history to? And if history is supposed to inform our politics, well, then we need to actually be clear in our politics, and that will help us understand the examples that we're choosing from. But, when you depoliticize history and make it seem as if what we're trying to do is simply just understand history and all of its truth and all of that, well, you're going to get a bunch of nonsense because it turns out history is sufficiently contradictory enough that you can actually make a case for any story you want to tell. Honestly, someone could do that. There is a way to tell a deeply anti-racist story of the United States. I think it's wrong. I think you're lying, but you could do it from real historical examples. And so what Machiavelli, it seems he's doing is you can't avoid the partisan standpoint if you want to make something come alive to lead you into cultivating the type of insight for your contemporary moment. That you have to bite the bullet on that.
Yeah. I think that's right. And he's clear about that. We could see maybe one way to talk about what Machiavelli's doing then is injecting partisanship into even these questions of method or of vision or of selection when it comes even to describing states of affairs. I always think about that kind of amazing line in the dedication to the prince where he ends it by being if you want to sketch a landscape, you got to climb up to the top of a mountain, right? And to comprehend the nature of the people, you got to be a prince. And he's saying this kind of as a flippant, defense against who are you to talk about what it is to be a prince? He's oh, well, to understand what it is to be a prince, you've got to be a citizen, right? There's this sort of
you have to be in the
perspectival. Yeah, you got to be in the valley, right, in order to see the mountain, right? There's this sort of perspectival and so situated, and for him, inextricably partisan character to any of this knowledge production, whether it's political or historical, which I think just has to be right. I don't know. I can't think outside this anymore.
What is he partisan toward exactly? I get what you guys are saying about the role of I think you're saying something true about Machiavelli, all of you, but we said that he wants to build a nation state, but I don't know, that seems like a thin kind of partisanship to me. Florence is being invaded. There are these barbarians. I'm just wondering what specifically is going on, because the idea of uniting Italy, the fact that Italy is even a thing that exists seems kind of far afield. So there's something specific he wants, and I'm just wondering because it's not he seems to be partisan towards having this outcome of a stable city-state, certainly.
Yes, that's right. I think that's it.
But is it partisan in some other way, or is that it?
I mean, maybe Owen, this historical context better than I do, but I think of him in this context as being very much like Hobbes, right? And so coming out of a period of extraordinary upheaval, tumults, there's all kinds of instability and violence, and no one can rely or count on anything. And he says, I mean, maybe being hyperbolic, but I don't know how hyperbolic he thinks he's being when he describes the situation of the Italians under the quote barbarians in the 26th and final chapter of The Prince. He's we've suffered every indignity for so long. We just need some stability, right? And so what does that take? What does that look like? And part of why he likes the Roman Republic in the Discourses so much is precisely because of its apparently unparalleled and at that time more or less unmatched stability and longevity, right? And so the question then again is always conjunctural for him. Given the conditions that exist at the moment, what would most likely bring about a situation of political or social stability? And he thinks something now maybe this gives context for why is he talking about great leaders and unification projects? And I think it's something like that. But then
he's obsessed with durability.
Yeah.
Right, but so yes, there's durability and stability, but I'm just again, I feel like that is definitely true. I feel like it needs more, it feels a little thin to me. So is it the republicanism he's partisan toward? The Roman Republic is serving this kind of guiding role for the kind of historical examples. He wants a republic, and he's choosing his examples accordingly to kind of show that the republic is what's needed. And he wants people to be able to navigate fortune in such a way that the republic is what one ends up with, ideally. I mean, is that the kind of...
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a kind of Republican partisanship in the Discourses. I think in the Prince, it's a much more narrow, much more narrow partisan project, which, like we were saying, has to do with liberating Italy from the influence of the French and from the Spanish and from being under what he calls the barbarian yoke, or under the controls of barbarian. But there he uses the language of non-domination. Right, so it's to establish Italy as a unified nation state, whatever that means in the 1500s. By the way, yeah, you're right to point that out. I'm not sure exactly what is entailed by that or what he means by that. In any case, I think there's a much more narrow project in the Prince, which has to do with liberation and the absence of like external fetters, which is a pretty restrictive and it is a pretty flimsy. Like, I agree.
No, I feel like you just added not flimsy to it. Like I feel like adding he had a vision, you know, like there's a kind of domination that's being experienced, and he's trying to figure out what the antithesis of that domination would be, and that like helps me understand the perspective on history that Will kind of got us going on.
Yeah, and I think the discourses, which I don't know as well, but I think there you get a much more rich account of what a political order, which is characterized by non-domination, actually looks like. Of course, they're not so radically distinct. Like there are lots of points in the discourses where he describes the necessary ruthlessness of leaders and certain things like that. But yeah, I think that's where you get a much more rich account of what is a political configuration, a new order look like that is characterized by non-domination, and which can have the durability of the 800 years that Sparta survived for or something. He's obsessed with that 800 years that Sparta lived for, but do it in a way where popular power isn't just extinguished.
Yeah. What's really incredible reading Machiavelli and reading figures from this time is like, God damn, this was a time when philosophers or politically engaged people, they had vision. They had like an idea that, you know, what if we can reshape the world, and what would it mean to do that? When I compare Machiavelli having this vision of like, you know what, fuck it, why don't we just unite Italy? Let's just create that. like I think it's weird because like we live in a time where like Italy just already exists. Germany already exists. France already exists. But like that was not the case in the 1500s. And then I think about now, what vision do our political leaders have now? Basically promises like, hey, it's gonna suck, but we're gonna make it suck just a little bit less for you. Like their vision, especially in the United States, really amounts to let's just let the good times roll. And you know, it's like really fascinating to me that if Machiavelli were alive, he'd look at these people and say, you know, how did these people become your leaders? There's no virtue there, not like moral bankruptcy. There's a complete lack of vision of what does it mean to try to reshape the world. And
you'd be like, you guys are so cucked. It's so
hear. Yeah, I just want to hear his analysis. I want to hear his analysis of like the fail sons. You know what I mean? Like Hunter and Don Jr. I bet you like
the failed sons. Okay. Oh my god. Just like
your ruling class are those people. Like,
like that's. I think that's
these fucking guys.
Like, and but they're still in power though. Like, did you all see the examples I gave? Like, it's not supposed to last for this long. Like, what am I missing here? But on
God. Okay.
He might be like, actually, some instability can go on and on and on.
He'd be shocked. He'd be like, that's not what I learned from history. But on a more serious note, like, I do think that it's important to, you know, to try to have this vision of what would a new world look like. I think now maybe there's more of an opening for that, but I think still for a lot of people that sounds totalitarian, that sounds ridiculous, that sounds like a nightmare. But the world we have now is not the world that always existed. The idea that there would be these stable nation states in Machiavelli's time, it's like, what are you talking about? How did that happen? And so there's also this sense that things can be radically remade otherwise. And this like sort of thinning of vision, especially from our leaders. My God, Machiavelli's the best person to read for that, to see like, you know, I think of that meme of like the buffed up dog and then the little dog who's like, you know, just like really
we
small,
are
like,
the little dog.
We are the little dog. Machiavelli's like, I unified Italy. We just want some universal basic income.
We're not going to get it.
Just a little UBI.
So actually, I wanted to. So there was one other like theme or concept that I wanted to draw our attention to, and I think connects to this actually, Will, because like, God, our leaders are so servile and stupid that ostensibly like this should not have been able to last, and yet there's no end in sight. So like one of the things that like Machiavelli talks about in both of these texts that I'm always fascinated is whenever he starts talking about a free people or a people or a multitude that's in the habit or accustomed to freedom, right? And he says things in like chapter 5 of The Prince. He's like, look, a city that's used to freedom, like you're either going to have to like if you're trying to conquer them, you're either going to have to accommodate yourself to them almost entirely, or you're going to have to kill every one of them, right? Or like, you know, whoever is the master of a city accustomed to freedom and you don't destroy it, expect to be destroyed yourself.
Very difficult. Yeah.
Right. It's extremely difficult if people are used to being free or having this, they're in this habit of freedom. These habits of freedom, and he also talks about it in terms of memory. He says things like, it's still in chapter 5. He's like, why can you expect to be destroyed yourself? Because whenever there's a rebellion, this kind of city, this free multitude, justifies itself by calling on the name of liberty and its ancient institutions, never forgotten, despite the passing of time and the benefits received from the new ruler, right? And he says, like, in republics, these free people, there's more life, also more hatred, greater desire for revenge. The memory of their ancient freedom does not and cannot let them rest. And the conclusion, QED, you might have to kill all of them, right?
It's so wild.
But I think, like, it's an amazing line, but like I think like part of the thing to like draw from this is that like we are fundamentally not in the habit of freedom. We are so unaccustomed. We're such an unfree people, multitude, or whatever you want it. Like I just think that this idea of like the nature of a social body having memory, having like a culturation and custom like this, and freedom being one of its vectors that seems so absent.
We're very
today,
accustomed to servility. Like lots of bad shit happens and everyone hates it. And it's like, man, that sucks. That's the new objective and unchangeable reality we have to reckon with, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess that's our fucking attitude. Yeah.
But I also even I don't want to like keep going too long, but I think that's a really important point when I think, how is the national memory of the United States retold? The examples that are chosen are always great figures, great leaders, and this is going to be me eventually building to my critique of Machiavelli with this over focus on individual leadership, even if he's trying to do something subversive. I'm completely open to that, but like I think the more obvious reason reading is this idea of great leaders shaping history. Is there something pacifying on that of the idea of waiting for leaders with vision to come, who will do this, and that all the social antagonisms that the United States faces, eventually some great person comes along, and usually it's the figure of a president, and they sign something, and then it's good again. How often we invoke FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, JFK, the fact that they're just mere initials, creates a type of national remembrance habit of, well, that is how history moves. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone believes it. That doesn't mean that there aren't countervailing forces. But I think it brings us back to the importance of the examples one chooses, because the examples are also a form of creating a type of memory, a type of habit of how one reflexively sees, well, when fortune opens up, who is the actor? And right now, I guess it's Joe Biden, which holy shit, like wow, like
okay,
that's not the man we expected.
But the man we deserve.
Jesus. Okay, I see all of that. Obviously, I'm not buying into the great man of history thesis either, but I do think that like I want to give Machiavelli just a little bit more credit, because in almost all of these examples that he's giving too, right? Like, they stick out, the names stick out because they're named, right? But then he also, like, these are always stories, like almost always stories too, in which like, the people, the citizens that he's trying to govern, like a lot of times they're not able to like establish the power they want because of the character of the people, or like, because of the ways in which like the people rose up and took them down. Like, we don't have names for them in the same way. They're not properly named the way like Agathocles or Tullius is, right? But like, it's not just this monologue of great men in Machiavelli in the same way that I think you're right in our United States retelling, and oftentimes it is.
Yeah, I think that that's there in Machiavelli, and it annoys me. But at the same time, I wonder if one way that you could rehabilitate it to an extent is that I was thinking of C.L.R. James and the way he talks about leadership in Black Jacobins and elsewhere, where he says like, yes, okay, we have to write this book is largely about Toussaint Louverture, but if like somehow they had managed to kill Toussaint Louverture, there would have been 1,000 more that would have grown out of that particular historical conjuncture, out of that population, right? Like that people. So of course, like I wonder if there is a way, and I'm not saying I know how to do this, but I wonder if there is a way to rehabilitate that conception, the emphasis that Machiavelli places on leadership, by making sure not to disattach it from the populace that leader leads. And he himself very, very rarely disattaches them from the populace whom they lead, which is why he says, these are all the ways that you can't overstep certain boundaries, or these are the ways that you can't build resentments among them. Like the leaders just end up looking so thoroughly dependent on the humors and attitudes of the people that are being led, that I think there is an opening there for thinking a more complex relationship between leadership and, I don't know, a broader, more collective political subject. Although I don't think it's like necessarily easy. Like, I think the concern is right.
I mean, yeah, this is why like people like Althusser and Gramsci were infatuated with Machiavelli, is because they're trying to work out a relationship between the party and the class. And so they're trying to work that out. And Althusser is like, as we talked about in a previous episode, he's thinking about why, like, Lenin is a Machiavellian figure. And he's thinking about the kind of political virtue, that this dude had, and why it's unintelligible to philosophy and so on. And this is a persistent theme on the left. I mean, we might be in a period in which people are thinking less about the idea of a revolutionary party, but we're still certainly thinking about how to have a party that actually represents working people, which in the U.S. has never come to fruition. And I think many people dream about, salivate about, think is absolutely necessary, but don't agree or don't know how to, get to that point. And there's a way in which the relationship between the party and the class, even in a different form, will continue to come back. So I do feel like this question about leadership remains salient even for people who take, the masses seriously as agents in history.
Right. Yeah. It's also the case that, like, there's all these weird dangers about fetishizing leadership. And one of them is that, like, it lets the rest of us off the hook. Right. But like, I still think that it remains true that, like, leaderlessness isn't working out very well for the left at the same time, And
there's a danger of fetishizing that as well. The idea of organic spontaneity, these things will just happen.
Right.
And so, I guess like we might be nearing the end, but I take it, from conversations with you, Lily, and I've read the Philip Pettit book on republicanism. There's this emphasis on, how to mold and build, sort of social character. And, that strikes me as a really difficult question because, if you simply put it that way, I think to a lot of people that sounds like social engineering. How do we make these people be the type of people we want them to be? I'm not saying republicanism is doing that, but I'm saying how do you, especially if you're with Machiavelli, you want this to articulate actually in the political arena, which was, Owen's second question. I don't know how well it goes starting to talk about, well, we need better character without, it sounded immediately like, this sort of dangerous social engineering moralism. But it strikes me that character isn't unimportant. If character is about the types of habits and actions and practical analyses you develop as a person, then that question can't be off the table. And Machiavelli clearly has it on the table.
I feel like there are just more and less conservative ways to construe this. There are more like Aristotelian interpretations of the idea of political virtue, where like basically what you're doing is becoming the kind of person who can serve the social function that you, like a functionalist version of virtue, which is just kind of accepting a role and doing it well. And then there probably is a more like communitarian version where you kind of think that everyone has to be united around similar values. And I think liberals don't like that for the reasons that you just said. And then there are, I think, there are other options, like it might be the case that citizens do, in fact, have to have a kind of constitutional patriotism. Like this is something Habermas tries to say, whether it's convincing, I don't know. But like it tries to preserve the kind of liberal ethos and the rest of society, I guess, but try to unite people around a political community. And then I think in a different way of putting it could be that people need to have the right kind of virtue to act politically, and that might be around a constitution or something else, but that's one kind of action. And being a virtuous citizen isn't the same thing as being like a moral person. So I think there are different, I don't have a good answer, but there are different options on the table for how to construe this. But I feel like the intuition for Republicans is a very compelling one, which is that in order to live in be a free individual, you have to live in a free society, and therefore the individuals in it have to maintain it. And I feel like the liberals that want to just be like, no, justice is, procedural, you don't need to share common values, even if it's political values or whatever. Like, I just don't understand how we all maintain this freedom together. Like, it seems the Republican vision seems to already invite us to think about power more relationally and so on. And then when it comes to these concerns about stability, and I just feel like Republicans have what our intuitions are, and liberals create this kind of counterintuitive world in which it's totalitarian for thinking we need to maintain our society.
The real freedom was complete dissolution at the end of the day.
Yeah, that was the best part.
Exactly. So like fragmentation and atomization, just doing whatever the fuck you want, just becomes like freedom, very confusing. So
with a question mark. Yeah.
So,
Big question.
what I like about the Republican uptake of Machiavelli is, even if I don't know how to solve that individual versus the Constitution or the polity problem, I feel like there is an intuition there that it's important to preserve, and that like modern, liberal common sense has kind of forgotten.
Okay, well, on that suggestive note, I think that does it for us today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks, wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/leftofphilosophy, and give us 5-star reviews and leave us a comment on your podcast app. Before closing out today, we'd like to just take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and are really grateful for your support. We're shouting out our patrons 20 at a time until we're caught up, starting with our earliest supporters. So today, we'd like to thank Hannah Jacobs, Dallas Jokic, Matthew Thompson, Adam Baltner, Ryan Sheldon, Peter Eck, Jordan Daniels, Lee Beck, Nicholas, Anka Gladnick, Manu Quadros, Nathan Holmes, Paul Bowman, Aaron Jacobson, Travis Jones, Justin Case, Tensa, Nora Barnacle, Zeki Salah, and Matthew Barnfield.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.